Welcome, welcome, welcome. So excited to have you here.
So excited to be here.
Yeah, I mean, like, should we, Mac, do you want to start?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us?
Like, just so you know, Sam kind of just gave a bit of an intro to the viewers here, kind of, who you are, where you're from, etc. So we're just going to jump right into it. So obviously, Sam has already said to everyone that you were a youth, which is
Yes.
crazy to think about. You're 28 years old. So I think you must be one of the youngest members of Parliament. And so kind of tell us a little about yourself and kind of how it's been, working with people who are more north of 30. So
Yeah, well, I'll maybe introduce myself in my language so the folks maybe who are Cree, who are tuning in, also have a chance. Tansei folks, Toao, Blake Desjarlais, Nisagasan, Pakchahanse, Miskutu, Skaganotsanya. My name is Blake Desjarlais. I'm sure you folks know that by now. I'm the proud member of Parliament for Edmonton Griesbach, and I'm Cree and Métis. I'm also the Canada's first two-spirit member of Parliament, which is like, woo! Janice Irwin is in my district. For those who follow Janice, we have a overlap as well. She's a super celebrity, and excited to be here and joining everybody. It's really awesome, and I'm on Treaty 6 land, joining folks from the historical treaty area in Alberta known as Treaty 6, which is also the traditional homelands of the Dene, Métis, and the Nakota Sioux, and even Iroquois folks.
Thank you so much for that.
So what is it like in Parliament? I mean, obviously, again, like I said, you're young. How is that?
I think being young in Parliament's almost like going to a space that has had no young people in it ever. You can tell when those spaces are when you go into like a hotel sometimes. They're like, whoa, this place is like from the 50s or 60s or 70s. And Parliament is kind of like that, even though we're in the new West Block. So Parliament is actually shut down, like the Parliament, the one that everyone sees with the clock tower. That building's under renovation. So we actually moved everything to West Block. And so West Block is where Parliament is now. And there's a kind of uniqueness to it because when I was I was actually before this the national director for Métis people in Alberta. And I used to work in Ottawa trying to get advanced Indigenous rights, and particularly Métis rights. And when we were working there, the old building was still functioning. And it's this very overwhelming, colonial, divisive kind of space, so extreme. But this newer building, it kind of lacks that British quality, which I appreciate from the new building. So I guess it's a mix of emotions, but it's also, as a young person, I think more unique because it's a space that I feel is sometimes hostile. And especially when they're talking about youth, that's what I think is the weirdest thing is politicians often will say, young people want this. And I'm in the room and I'm like what? That's like
it's
the
me.
most bizarre thing.
It's me. I'm young people.
Yeah, exactly. I'm young. You didn't even talk to me about this. So I think we were definitely seen as outside of that building and not within it.
You kind of just segued into almost like my follow-up kind of question is, you mentioned that you were Cree and Métis, and you said that, the old building's, British. And how does it feel, being a part of a system that, wasn't exactly designed for you?
Oh, these systems. Well, first of all, preface it with this. I believe my role in Parliament and being an elected official, particularly being of Indigenous background, is really one of harm reduction. Like, I know first and foremost, I'm not going to go there to change the systems that have historically been designed, no matter who sits there, honestly. There's been good politicians in Canada. However, these systems don't provide oftentimes for good to be the result. And there's huge issues with it, but I see my role, especially as a New Democrat in that space, as harm reduction. To say, hey, whoa, I really don't think we've taken into account the perspectives of the 2S LGBTQ community, for example. Something that I'm really passionate about as a member of the Two-Spirit community. Like, for example, just recently, the government tried to cut off funding. They're like, we gave you a whole bunch of funding for the 2S LGBTQI communities, and guess what? We're not really going to renew it. After like decades and decades of discrimination, that the community is just supposed to all of a sudden heal overnight from one round of grant funding. It's impossible. And so I learned a lot in my role, especially working with some of the organizers to try to enforce, the fact that you can't leave these people behind, and we're going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that you don't. And that kind of leadership is the kind of things that actually make Parliament work. It's not so much politicians, but when people gather, like what's happened in the 2S LGBTQ community, when they stood up united and said, we're not going to take this, they did it overnight, literally. Minister Marcy Ian all of a sudden came out and said, here's the money. Problem is, that fight's not over yet. We have to do it every single year. Whenever they're not watching, they'll cut something. You know, our public social safety net in Canada is truly under attack.
Oh, that too.
Yeah.
I think the social safety net sucks. It like what we were taught about in school. Like, don't get me wrong, I know we're privileged. I know there are a lot of things that we have in a country like Canada that where my parents are from, that wasn't given to them. But it also it doesn't feel like the bare minimum should be like enough. Yeah, like what? Like they need, like I feel like as the daughter of immigrants, my parents have always told me like strive for the best. And Canada was like, meh, just enough. That's cool. That's like healthcare sort of covered, not mental health, not all these other aspects, but we'll cover it. Sure, whatever. Exactly. And I do think it's important that we engage more in these conversations. Like in particular, like when you see things happening in the States right now with what's going on in Florida and Texas around just like
education,
like allegate, like they're criminalizing just like being there for your kids. And like it's just like we know too much now about Canada and the fact that we're not that different from our American counterpart, that we cannot allow, like you have to be like constantly vigilant around these issues or you risk a very slippery slope that I would rather not go down.
Oh yeah, like corporations are powerful, right? And that's really part of politics we never talk about is the money. Where are these parties getting their money from? You know, it's something that we really as Canadians have to think about. And that's largely what motivates the interests of some of these groups. And even in Alberta, just the other day, like yesterday, Jason Kenney, the premier here, we have a conservative premier under the banner of the United Conservative Party, which is like, whoa, extreme name. But they have passed, their speech from the throne came out and they didn't mention the word public. They talked about healthcare. They talked about surplusing private healthcare in Alberta right now. And they didn't talk about 1 ounce of our public healthcare system or even the public systems that people rely on. So they're truly eroding right at the base. And I think you made a really good point when you talked about like the fact that Canada as a country does have a lot of privilege, but there's some people who don't ever experience that privilege. And I think about, you know, some of my relatives who are still on reserve who don't get clean water. I grew up without clean water. When I first moved into a place that had clean water, I was mind blown, like literally mind blown that clean water can come out of a tap.
Wow.
Like I grew up on bottled water my whole life, and it was pretty remarkable to see. It makes a difference in people's lives to have clean water. And that one thing people think is almost like a right in Canada, but Canada treats it like a privilege, that people don't even get this still today. My family still right now as we speak, in my house where I grew up in Fishing Lake Metis Settlement, does not have clean water today. And that's something that the government promised ages ago. They said this is going to be fixed. And that when you talk to Indigenous people about that, when you go to them and say, hey, we understand, we hear you, we listened, and we're going to fix the water issue, that means something to people. That means a lot to the elders who lived there forever and are thinking, are my kids going to have water? And they really hold on to that promise just for it to come to 2020 and their heart be broken all over again. It's re-traumatizing to this long legacy in Canada that continuously says, we're going to promise this to you, but we're not going to give it to you. You know, that's really the story of the historic treaties. It just never happened.
And I think, you know, like the thing that I always equated slowness with our government. Like I was always like, of course, like it takes time. Like I would like justify inaction. And then we saw with the pandemic, especially at the beginning, there was like immediate action around these things. Like we were ready to run it, and we took, and I was like, oh, so like we can run. We just like choose what issues we run around. And why isn't clean water like just like clean
as
water
urgent as anything else that we've been, you know, privy to witnessing in the last 2 years that were just measures that were instantly implemented.
And even IRCC is same thing. Like we have like 1.5 million backlog cases in IRCC, immigration, refugee, and Canadian citizenship. For those who aren't certain, it's a huge problem. Like we have families right now as we speak who are separated, sometimes for upwards of a decade, kids never getting to see their parents, all because Canada wants to have a regulatory process that puts people through the mud when they're oftentimes struggling with poverty, they're struggling with sometimes war in the countries of their of origin, and worse. And we don't even talk about some of the worst aspects of being not having citizenship in Canada, which you touched on, which was healthcare. We don't even provide healthcare to people in Canada that don't have citizenship. That is extreme level of discrimination, particularly because these people are paying in to our social safety net. They're paying in to Canada's economy. They're filling in gaps that Canadians can't fill. Labor gaps, huge labor gaps. And we even heard from even farmers who are saying, we're going to shut our farm down because we don't have enough temporary foreign workers. It's like, you know, people know how important these programs and these folks are to not just our economy, but our communities, and don't treat them that way. We don't even give them health care. You know, it's a completely broken system that leaves more people behind than it even takes. And it's what people are often shocked about in Canada. They think Canada could be a country to welcome people. It's supposed to be, there's a lot of mythology around coming to Canada. And it's just such a different experience, I think, for many folks when they get here.
Definitely. Well, let's take a hard pivot because I want to get through some of these other questions, but like I want to come back to this too because there's just, I feel like you know so much, and our community here could just benefit from listening to you like talk about this all the time forever until the end.
I'll be on again.
I mean, I love it.
You will.
So what I wanted to ask, and what our community's been kind of talking about here at the OnCanada Project is, okay, you're from the federal NDP, like you're an MP, like we've all seen Jagmeet, we know who he is, but then there's also the provincial NDPs, and that will vary from province to province to province. Are y'all friends? Like, what's going on here? What's the relationship?
I love that question. Yeah, are we friends? So, well, let's put it this way: we're more like family than we are like friends. Friends oftentimes will you know, their interests are often you unite with friends for the purpose of ensuring that you have common interests that you can build on. But when you're in a family, your lives depend on each other. But it also means that you have the right to tell them sometimes you disagree. Sometimes you don't like what they're doing, but they also have the right to say you have it totally wrong. And so when we think about like provincial and federal, particularly in Canadian federalism, which is a system that allows for this because the province and the federal government have different responsibilities. And so because they have different responsibilities and there's no supremacy, for example, like our parliament cannot trump, trigger word first of all, like I didn't like that, can defeat, you know, or overpower a local legislature is not possible in Canada. But in other countries it is, where the parliament is supreme in terms of their laws, and they kind of give power to the provinces. But in Canada, they're completely separate. And so New Democrats happen to be the only party federally and provincially that are the same. So the NDP is actually one big party. So the provincial, whether you're in NDP Ontario, NDP Alberta, that party is the same party as the national federal NDP. But they have a completely different organization. So just because we are the same party doesn't mean we're the same organization. So the organization part is completely separate and distinct. And the federal caucus, for example, that I'm a part of, there's 25 of us. We have our own federal NDP team. And then every province has their own individual federal NDP team. And we treat each other with, I'd say, that family glove. You know, we will give them information that relates to issues that we think are really important. Like one, for example, is that I'm pushing is decrim. Like I think decriminalization is needed a long time ago. And that's something I want our provincial counterparts to get on side. Sometimes they don't, you know, but there are sometimes they do. For example, Yukon NDP, we just had their convention. They passed a super historic policy within their party to now make safe consumption sites and decriminalization the policy for the Yukon NDP. And so it's kind of like we're advocates and trying to enforce other parts of our own large organization to get on board with ideas. And it's, I think, a more democratic process, to be honest, because it allows for conflict to exist in a situation where sometimes it'd be easier to walk away. In this case, you can't. You have to confront your colleagues and say, you know, if you really want this to happen, you really got to compromise and truly understand each other. So tell me, why is it different in Quebec? Explain that to me. Or why is it different in Newfoundland? And it gives me, as a federal member of parliament, this kind of perspective I would never have if I was a conservative or a liberal, kind of siloed in my own party. You know, it's like having friends, a family that can just call you out for stuff, you know, and know that at the end of the day, we're family and we're friends, we're going to love each other, but it's okay to have a difference of opinion. I think that's the power of being in one party like that. But we're not the same organization.
So the other parties, so like the Liberals and the Conservatives, for example, they're not the same party across the country.
No. So even though they're they're affiliated, like that's a really important word, is affiliation. So conservatives, of course, in each province are affiliated, quote unquote, to the federal conservatives. Jason Kenney, for example, here in our province, was a federal minister under Stephen Harper's government. And he was the Minister of Immigration for a while, a couple other things. And then he just totally jumped ship when they lost the election in 2015 and became, wanted to become the Premier of Alberta. But when he did that, he, of course, hired many members of the federal conservatives. He even ended up hiring Stephen Harper's son to be part of his Premier's office. And so there's huge overlap there, even though they don't want to say it, because they want to preserve the right to say, if they disagree with a policy, they don't want to have to confront it. They don't want to have to go and say, for example, they don't want to have to go send Aaron O'Toole, former leader of the Conservative Party, to go talk to Jason Kenney and say, hey, I disagree with your mask mandate or with your your QR code system. They don't want to have that situation. And so they pretend they're different and they're estranged from each other when they have issues that they disagree with. But when they agree, they're like at the Calgary Stampede together, throwing their cowboy hats and, high-fiving each other. They're all buddies.
So can you technically publicly disagree with a policy that your party is passing? So if you, Blake, decide or are put into a situation where you disagree with how Yukon NDP is a policy that they're running, or even the Alberta NDP is running, can you say, I do not agree? Or is there some form of like fraternity kind of Bible code that you cannot publicly disagree?
No, we could publicly disagree. We have that happen all the time, actually. It's not necessarily conducive to party politics. We often hear that from the political masterminds in the country. It's not conducive to be fighting openly amongst the caucus and things like that. But at the same time, we do it. We don't punish anybody. Like, a group of MPs, for example, on the Wet'suwet'en issue, four of us came out and said, we disagree with BC NDP. Like, I'm Indigenous, so there's certain allegiances and certain, not allegiances is a bad word, but principles that make our party great. And we won't forego those principles, particularly individuals, right? And so we won't. But the party itself doesn't treat us with a heavy hand, and it's like comes down with a discipline like they do in other parties, where you get kicked out, you get put in the back bench, you lose everything, right? Then that's the kind of unique power that parties have that they don't talk about. They never talk about the little titles and badges and stuff they give you, these kind of benefits to make you sound really cool or really good at something. They don't talk about how they use that as political chips. But in the NDP, at least in my experience, going against sometimes party line, I've never been slapped or
reprimanded,
threatened or reprimanded. Oftentimes it's, I understand you disagree with this, Blake, and let's have more conversation. Let's keep talking about it. And even times it gets, the Jug Meat's actually really great at this. He can recognize when someone is in a disagreement, and he'll always schedule a follow-up meetings. He'll say, I want you to have space to talk about this. If you disagree with me, tell me where X, Y, and Z, and we're able to have that space to go through it. And so I think that's great for someone who's a New Democrat who doesn't agree with sometimes policies that other New Democratic family members make.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, I feel like Mac and I were talking about this morning. Were we not, Mac?
Yeah, we were. It's actually really refreshing to hear you say that you're able to have a disagreement, because I think, and I can not speak for the three of us, but I think that definitely in the two other parties that we've spoken about, they have a general overreach of what a Canadian is as just this one bubble. And many Canadians have many different issues and needs and wants and ideas. So it's really nice to hear that you actually can disagree and have like a proper conversation around it, rather than walk the aisle.
Yeah, exactly. Walk it out. I can't change their votes sometimes, though. You know, I can't force them to vote differently, but I can at least change my vote.
Yeah, I think
in order to for your voice to be heard, like their voices to be heard via you, right?
Yes.
So even if you can't change the vote, at least they're being heard.
Yes, that can guarantee.
And I think, Blake, you were saying that like you're allowed to, like there's some parties where you're not allowed to like disagree or publicly like fight amongst the caucus, but I kind of wish I could see some of these fights. Like I feel like
I feel like it would humanize the game a little bit.
I don't like, it feels very fake that we're seeing like you fought inside in theory and then you've come out in public and you've made your stance. That feels like awkward. Like I would rather see the disagreement so then I know that there's someone who's maybe seeing it from my perspective, advocating for that in the room. That feels like more honest to me almost. Like if our leaders worked for us, shouldn't, like, I don't know. I think that makes more sense than this sort of like weird,
groupthink.
It's like very like, whatever you say, Your Majesty. Like no, hard pass.
Exactly. No, it's a serious problem in Canadian politics, and it is a problem, and I think we need to see it like that rather than part of our democracy, but more so like a baggage in our democracy. And it's this kind of legacy of party politics that's carried over since the British Parliament, and this British parliamentary system that was created in the Imperial Parliament, when they decided to have opposite benches, they literally call the one opposite bench Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. So they're forced in many ways to be united in their opposition against the government. Like that's the framework they set up for. And it forces you to, in order to protect your position, there's this idea of caucus solidarity. Conservatives talk about it 24/7, this idea of caucus solidarity, and criticize New Democrats for being too open about this idea, making sure we have a discussion about it. But I do think you're right. Like I always think in our caucus meetings, we have caucus meetings like every week, and this is where we just go off, on anything. We fight there, we love there, we talk about commonalities there, but we really try to hash out our differences. I always thought, what a remarkable experience it would be if like this is how we communicated with Canadians. Showed them that there's a truly diverse and highly intellectual group of members of Parliament that you would never see otherwise. Like I think of Leah Gazan or Matthew Green or Laurie Idloud or Heather McPherson, some of these power folks that teach me something every single day. I wish they can share that with all Canadians. But because of how our system operates and this idea that the Liberals and the Conservatives, if they find any crack that they can exploit, that they will. And that's this common fear that all these parties have, that the opposition or someone's going to find this and create a wedge issue. They're going to divide their own caucus based on this because they know where the wedge is and they'll attempt to exploit it. And so it really shows that the exploitation of partisanship is far more important to these parties than having in-depth intellectual discussions about the issue. And that's a serious issue in our parliamentary system, and one that can only really be fixed through discussions like this, where we can talk about the problem, and then hopefully, good, smart people smarter than me can think of a system that we can make this accountable. Or how do we break out of this mold where we don't jeopardize progressive votes?
So speaking of agreeing and disagreeing, the NDP is right now, obviously we have a minority government, as most folks know, and the NDP is known in the House of Commons as a kingmaker. Can you tell us more what that means and maybe what power, quote unquote, that allocates to the party as a kingmaker?
Especially since that's not a term that Jagmeet would be like everybody, I am the kingmaker. Like,
hello, folks.
Congratulations, I am here. Yeah, he's not out there showing up like that. Move away. Right.
Literally.
People do say that, even if he doesn't claim that title. What does that mean?
Kingmaker largely means, in the context of politics, it's in the framework of power politics. And power politics in Canada requires 170 votes in the majority of our House of Commons to pass anything, to pass laws. And the House of Commons is the highest democratic institution that can do this. Technically, the Senate is our upper house. And then we have the Governor General, which is representative of Her Majesty the Queen, but they don't do anything. And I'm okay saying that. New Democrats have been opposed to the Senate for a long time. The idea that the Prime Minister can just appoint anybody and they're there for life, and they have
interesting.
Power.
Why are you opposed to that?
Because it's like an aristocracy, you know. It's if I can appoint my friends and my family to sit in a Senate that they can never be removed from. Like, for example, Lynn Dayak, a senator who's really racist. She was someone who is hyper opposed to the narrative, which is true, about residential schools. And she had this platform to just spew hate and keep going and going. And she was never can't remove her. She was not accountable to the electorate. She never got one vote other than Stephen Harper's vote to put her there. And she has all this power and public dollar, when it should be Canadians who have that power, and it should be democracy who has that power. You know, the people who are elected should have the voice and rights to say what should happen in our country, because they have to go back to the electorate. You know, and whenever the election happens, I have to go face the music and the noise for decisions. But these senators never have to. They get to sit there forever and ever and ever and ever, and never be held accountable. But
yeah, thank you so much. That was a side note. I'm sorry. So
yeah,
Kingmaker, you need 170 votes out of the 338.
Yes, 170. Right now, the Liberals don't have that. So minority government in Canada means that the Liberals need to find a group, either the Conservatives, the Bloc, or the New Democrats, to pass their laws or to pass anything they put forward. And so New Democrats, because they know exactly where we stand. We want stronger social safety net. We want farmer care. We want mental health care. We want to see truly progressive policies hit the floor. They know that if they table those policies, we're going to vote for them. But they also know if they table policies that we disagree with, we're going to adamantly fight against them. And so they have to appeal in many ways to parties like New Democrats in order to pass legislation. So the name Kingmaker comes from that process of being able to grant these laws permission to pass in the House of Commons. It grants them power. So the New Democrats, when they're called Kingmakers, it said that they have enabled or passed laws because we were able to do that. And one of the really good examples is CERB, or CRB it was known as. You know, CRB, the Liberals came and they were defending tooth and nail how $1,000 is enough to get people by. You know, people who aren't employed can live off $1,000. You know, especially after the next thing he said was the average rent in Toronto, the livable regular rent is $2,700, and he was willing to give people $1,000. Like that doesn't add up. And so we pushed and said, we're not going to support you then. You know, if you're not going to take this seriously, if you're not going to make it $2,000, then we're just not going to support you. And of course, they were forced at that point, in order to get that passed, to put it to $2,000. And when they repealed it, of course, we were sad about that. And they just found a new partner. They found the Bloc Québécois to help take down our protections, which we think is sad, but that's unfortunate for politics. So they're also a Kingmaker party.
So
there's
I'm gonna. No, go ahead.
There's two Kingmakers. I didn't know that about the Bloc. That's annoying.
Yeah.
Trish says, but doesn't the Senate guarantee a stability in the country as the party change elections are over? So isn't there a certain security that comes with having a Senate in place?
There is like a thought, a traditional Canadian thought, that the Senate is the chamber of sober second thought, and it mimics what's known as the House of Lords in England. So our system is set up proportionate to England's.
These names, I swear to God.
So much.
I know. Yeah, the House of Lords
and the Kingmaker.
And the Kingmaker.
I could just see Boris Johnson's hair flying.
Yeah,
too much.
It's really British. So this House of Lords, the Senate is our House of Lords. And how the House of Lords was created in England was essentially all of the former dukes and people who had land holdings during the feudal system said, I don't think regular people should have all the power in England when they decide to become a constitutional monarchy, and wanted to protect their landholders' rights. The government of the time said, okay, well, you don't have to ever go to the electorate. We're going to protect your historic place of privilege, and we're going to give you what's known as the House of Lords. And Canada, a country that was after this whole process, said we need a House of Lords too. And at that time, and still today, you need to own land to be a senator.
Yes.
You need to own $5,000 worth of land in your home district or province in order to be a senator.
No way.
Yeah, so it's not.
Isn't that
no way?
Yeah. Brutal.
Which actually makes me think of, we had a panel the other day on Indigenous leadership, and Chuk from Future Ancestor Services mentioned that the word colonization comes from the origin word is colon, which is Latin, I believe, and colon actually means land. And so when we speak about colonization and or decolonization, it's important to understand the linguistic heritage to really understand that it's ultimately all about land. Hence why we see movements as land back. Hence why I'm assuming the landlords, not the landlords, the lords need land.
The lords
the senators,
of the land.
The lords. Fascinating.
Yeah.
It's horseshit that you have to own land to run to be in the Senate and then be given a job forever, because that means only people who are wealthy can apply, and then you also have to be buddy in a system to get appointed to it, and then you just sit there forever in the seat. And a friend of ours, I don't think she'd mind us saying this, Senator Kim Pate, was telling us that for a lot of senators it's a pay cut, because they were making so much money before that over 100,000, like 150,000 salary, annual salary, is actually a pay cut. And those are the people making like our sober second thought. That's not a sober second thought. That's some privileged shit going on up there.
It's an oligarchy. It's an official oligarchy.
Literally, though.
Like they've been in politics a long time. They want to protect their not only their prestige, but they also want to be able to remain relevant and have direct access to government whenever their stocks fall or whenever anything happens in the country, right? They have a direct line to power in our country, which is unfair for Canadians. It's unfair for regular people in my community. It's unfair for houseless folks who can never become a senator. You know, it's unfair. And I think that's what makes my opposition to the Senate so real. And I'm okay speaking to my opposition to it, because it's truly an oligarchy. You know, you look at it, they're unelected. How do you even hold them accountable? Like Lynn Bayuk, senator. For those who are watching, Google Lynn Bayuk. And
I really am going to do that right after.
You're going to be so disgusted to know that she was able to spout hate for so long against survivors of residential school. She just straight up said residential schools were great and Canada is awesome for doing it, was her tagline for years and years and years, until finally her own colleagues had to say, okay, Lynn, you know, you're giving us all a bad name, you're taking us all down, so we're going to kick you out of our caucus. You're not in the Conservative caucus anymore, and a court even forced her to take down her website because it was hate motivated, and it was extreme.
Still a senator?
I think she was finally removed from the bench after her colleague, because it has to be from her own colleagues.
Okay, so there is a way for them to be removed.
I think she's the only one ever.
Wow.
Yeah.
That tracks.
It's if they breed.
Butt head of yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Sam, do you want to?
Let's so we talked about kingmakers. Let's jump on to your role right now, because hold on, I've got a long list. I did it at the beginning, but just in case people have joined us now, you are I'm cheating. I'm reading it off the thing. The critic for the Treasury Board, diversity and inclusion, youth, sport, and post-secondary education, which is like, I feel like a trifecta, a square. Like there's so many things in there that young people care about just on its own.
Exactly. Yeah.
And deputy critic for the 2S LGBTQI plus rights, as well as immigration, refugees, and citizenship. What does that mean?
I was literally going to say what it.
So it literally means, like, in terms of, I broke it all down to like plain language, it means it's my job to hold those ministers with the same portfolio accountable. And so when we look at, for example, my critic role for 2S LGBTQI communities, when the 2S LGBT, it's like kind of a flag to say, hey, if anyone has any issues with this minister, particularly Marcy Ian, when she was not giving any answers about funding, when she was like, it's done, no one's going to get any more money. They came to us, and it's my role to really be there as their champion and just say, hey, Marcy, you know, I keep hearing about it, and you're going to hear from me more and more and more that if you don't give the 2S LGBTQI community the extension funding they need, we're going to go really hard against you. And they're going to come to me for that support. So it becomes a partisanship issue. So they don't want to lose votes. They don't want to lose face, right? And it becomes a pressure game. And so my role is to liaise their concerns in a way that they don't have to do it. You know, I can be the bad guy and protect their organizations and say, I'm concerned from what I'm hearing from folks about this. And it has a particular weight because the critic role, that if it's coming from the critic, it means the party is also united around this. So my colleagues will stand firm with me as the critic for that area, and to have that kind of joint support going forward on those issues. Or it might be diversity and inclusion, where we're trying to look at employment in the federal public sector for particularly trans women. You know, why is it that trans women do not occupy any senior roles in our government? Serious question. People want to know. And it's my job to go to the ministries and ask these questions and try to see ways that we can get more accountability and also more equity in that role. And I work directly with Minister Hassan, who is the Minister for Diversity and Inclusion, and he has to respond to these questions. So when I ask in the House of Commons, when I stand there and say, where is the for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing fund, he has to rise publicly and say, we don't have it. And so it's my role to keep them accountable in a democratic way for those roles.
So can anybody come up to you?
Oh yeah, we have stakeholder meetings with individuals, with just the individual family members who may be going through lots of this stuff, and that I do that most often for immigration. So my district here in Edmonton Griesbach, we're proudly the home of probably, I think, all of Alberta, but for sure Edmonton's largest new Canadian population. And we have a huge cultural mosaic here, but it's also sometimes difficult for that cultural mosaic to have the expression it requires in order to feel as though they're all parts of the community, because there's still a lot of racism and stigmatization everywhere. And so when we think about tackling some of those issues, we often talk to individuals, because it's really hard for them oftentimes to either share their story or share what they're going through with a bunch of people. And sometimes it's just one-on-one, just saying what happened and tell me about your experience going here. And I learn a lot that way. And sometimes I'll work directly on that individual's case, particularly if my staff have flagged it and they've met with them, and it's at a point where that person is going to be deported tomorrow, and it's like, oh my goodness, so I got to really get on that and talk to the minister and say, you're about to send someone into a war zone, that's going to be on you. And we talked to that person just the other day, and you've got to do something about this now. Is kind of the level of individualism. But of course we go all the way up to the sometimes big organizations like Moms Stop the Harm, decrim, they're more like, I'd say, a good drug policy and community org of awesome mothers and allies who know the real cost of the opioid crisis and are truly advocates, and they're all over Canada. So sometimes we go from the individual all the way to big organizations like that. So it's really anybody.
So if I'm like, because when we create content, we really try to include what people's next steps are going to be, because we've all got a role to play here. You're a member of Parliament, but we're active and engaged Canadians, and we want to take action around these issues. So if we often go email the minister, but would a better strategy be email the minister and CC the critic, so the critic is also hearing what you're saying? Because
that's a great question.
Immediately gonna happen. All of our content's gonna start having the critics.
Yeah, that's a game changer.
Because we're the bad guys, to the government. They don't want to hear from us. If the critics are mad, they know we're gonna be a thorn in their back for a long time. And without putting stakeholders at risk, without putting engaged Canadians at risk of the government, because sometimes this country has a history of holding things against people. Particularly Indigenous groups, particularly people of color groups. If you hurt them, they sometimes will ignore or hurt you back. And we see that with partisan politics all the time. If the Liberals win power, there's a whole group of organizations that get money and support there. But if the Conservative win, there's a whole different group of people who get money and support there. And so it's sad that reality exists. But in order to, I think, stop that from happening, we can use the critics of all parties to say, this is important and should be nonpartisan. That's how important this issue is. In order to try to break down that power structure that exists of forcing people into liberal or conservative camps, because lots of issues are truly just beneficial for all Canadians, without partisanship, like decriminalization, for example.
Damn.
Good question.
Thank you.
So yeah, CCS, Blake Desjarlais, parliament.ca.
That's a great tip.
I'm gonna start. All of our content's gonna say that. Be like, are you mad? Great. Go
email Blake.
Exactly.
Just everyone from OnCanada Project starts emailing Blake. Just I didn't like the ending of Victoria, and I need someone to explain to me what is happening. Blake, can you help? But not that type of stuff. Literally everything else. Matt, do you have a question?
I do, but Blake, how are you doing for time?
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Okay. I think we're good right till the hour.
Cool.
On my end at least. Or let me double check.
Check with Paige.
Yeah, exactly.
Check with Paige.
Yes, we're good we're good for another 15.
Amazing.
Great.
Let's rapid fire these. These are 3 good ones.
Yeah. So quick answer from you. What are you currently working on, and what do you think Canadians should know about, like, what you're working on?
Okay, what I'm working on, the second question is really interesting too, but what I'm working on is, the really big one I'm passionate about is Bill C-216. So C-216, for those who don't know, is decriminalization of drugs. My family, particularly Indigenous and Black community members here in Edmonton Griesbach and across the country, are disproportionately affected by this. Health Canada said it, Alberta Medical Association has said it, the government's own report says it. We have to actually decriminalize this because it's disproportionately affecting those communities. And it's about policing in many ways. They're using drugs, people's use of drugs, as a way to incarcerate people. And we can't in any way, shape, or form allow this system to continue, because it allows for our prison system to have a disproportionate, overwhelming amount of Indigenous persons and people of color. It's huge. Like, if you Google it right now, it's majority of our relatives are in those places. And so Bill C-216 it was supported by Mom Stop the Harm, who we're really working with on this. They really want to see this done right. And we really want to take a non-partisan approach to this. We want to make sure that everyone, because it affects everybody, like conservatives, liberals, every one of us have lost family members to this terrible terrible drug poisoning crisis. And what's happening in many ways is there's 3 parts of the bill that will address unique parts of the crisis. So the first part of the crisis is decriminalizing drugs, first and foremost. We cannot treat the crisis with incarceration. We have to stop giving that power to police. Police should not have the ability to arrest people who are going through a crisis or are using these drugs recreationally. I don't care how you're using the drug. My issue is largely trying to make sure that no one dies from it, which includes safe supply. And so safe supply is critically important to making sure we have good drug policy in Canada, because if we can guarantee safe supply, then we can guarantee that those drugs are not being poisoned. They're not going to be a bad batch. They're going to be guaranteed safe supply. And so that's one big part of it, the third part of it. But the second part of it is also expungement of records, because I have relatives, my own brother, for example, back when he was much younger in his life, he sold, small amounts of marijuana. He got fined for that. He had to go to a judge, and he can't get a job. He can't get a house. He can't get a car. Like, these are real things that are affecting people in the community who just want to have a good life like everyone else. And so we want to expunge those records. We want to make sure that people who used or have charges for possession can have those records expunged, and so that they can get back to doing what they need to do in their life. Getting a home or getting a car or getting a job even is how that works for them. And then, of course, the last part is a national strategy, a national safe supply strategy, and a national action plan that looks at how we can ensure safe supply and how we can ensure that there's supports for folks who truly want to perhaps stop doing drugs. Maybe they identified it as an addiction, but I really want to make a preface here. Our bill isn't to divide these two groups, because there are lots of people who use drugs recreationally, and this will assist in that as well. And they don't deserve to be criminalized either. Many people are self-medicating, for example. They have their own trauma. They have their own reality. It shouldn't be up to medical professionals, or especially the police, to define what that looks like. It should be the individual, and we want to give power back to individuals who decide to do this. So that's my big focus right now. It was the 2S LGBTQ funding, and the very first priority was banning conversion therapy.
Yes.
Something we campaigned on, and we're like, go. We finally did that way faster than I thought it was going to happen, honestly. But I'm sad now, because conservatives come up to me now and are like, say ridiculous things, because it was unanimous. Technically, the whole thing was unanimous, meaning everyone in the House agreed to it. But all of a sudden, a week after that, conservatives from my own province here in Alberta were writing op-eds saying, oh, they didn't know the vote was happening, which is why it went through. I would have said no to it if I knew it was happening. You know, that's discouraging to me. That's sad and it's mean. It's disgusting, you know, that they were able to.
Late.
Yeah, it's way too late. And why do that? Why backpedal like that? So I was disappointed about that backpedaling. But then the 2S LGBTQ funding, we got that announcement, which was great. And now it's trying to pass this bill, 216. So you can also check out, if you folks are really interested in this, we really have, we want to try to inform as many people as possible. If you share that message, of course, and know about that message, I'm happy to meet with community folks and do town halls. Maybe we can do a town hall on it later on as well with your viewers. But people need to know that this is going to be voted on. People will vote on this term.
Amazing. I know I shouldn't ask a side question, but I can't help it. I'm going to do it anyways. Okay, we wrote about the conversion therapy ban in Canada, so on our grid, and one of the things that our team, like I was struggling with when I was helping write it, was we legalized like gay marriage and we gave everyone rights, but then we didn't, like, it feels like, why aren't these policies like holistic in that nature, where, you know, you're saying we have as a country decided that love is love, go for it, you do you, queen, like whatever. But then, as it should be, because like literally, but then like don't undo some of this trash shit that's around. It's not like we don't know about it. Like, why isn't that all happening at once? Doesn't that feel like part of
I'm a huge critic of the Liberals. This is like whoever's in government, they have the choice to do this. Right now, they can have a holistic policy. They can do that. Like we've seen throughout COVID, for example, we can come with huge solutions costing billions of dollars, and we know we can actually have the government deliver those services and deliver that whole of government approach, which is often the word they use, whole of government approach. And when it came to, for example, legalization of gay marriage in Canada, you're right. There should have been a consequential amendment that allowed for the ending of discrimination across all sectors. If it was about discrimination, then it should have been about ending discrimination for that community across the board. But it didn't happen. And this is this idea of incremental progressivism. This incremental progressivism is this liberal notion largely that we can get to where we need to be as a country, to the solutions progressives want to see over a long period of time. I don't buy it because people in my community don't have the whole kind of time that they're talking about. You know, we don't have, people are being prosecuted right now for being members of the 2S LGBT community overseas, something Canada committed to ending a long time ago. They said, we're going to appoint a special envoy to end 2S LGBTQ discrimination across the world. Still haven't seen it. They said, we're going to end the blood ban. It's going to be great. You know, we're going to help Canadian Blood Services who's asked for it. And we're going to, I think it's called HEMA Quebec. Maybe my friend, I think it's called HEMA Quebec, also asked for it. And still nothing. And so they want to have this incremental approach that I believe has something to do with the election cycles. You know, I'm not a seasoned politician like they are and can match these up to when the election cycle is going to be, but I truly think it has something to do with that.
Yeah, that really grosses me out. I think that's trash. Like,
oh, completely.
It's like, and you're absolutely right. You can't incrementally move towards, like, if you know that there is a human rights violation going on, you can't be like, some of you will get some rights, but not
also
all
like we'll get there in 50 years when your kids
from
are
all my
25.
white privilege, let me share that with you. Like, no, you clearly are not being directly affected by the problem. Anyways, hard pivot back to what we were talking about. Just had to ask, so this past week there were reports, this does actually relate to what you were previously saying, but then I took us on a tangent. This past week there were reports of a Black man in Alberta being killed by the police while experiencing a mental health crisis. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because that's something we've started talking about on our grid. But yeah, I mean, you're from Alberta.
Yeah. Well, police violence has always been an issue in Canada. You know, there was never a time in Canadian history where police were actually doing, you know, a fair, appropriate, non-biased job. There was never that time. That's a myth in Canada, that the police are apolitical or the police have some kind of power to not see or be affected by race, to not be affected by gender, to not be affected by the real social dynamics and social indicators that guide everyone in Canada. You know, when people see me and see, hey, there's this Native guy here, 9 out of 10 times in my experience, this is dead honest, my experience with the hospitals, 9 out of 10 times they ask me how much I've had to drink that day. 9 out of 10 times I'm asked that. And it's only because of my last name. They know that the Desjarlais are a big Indigenous family, and they think I've just gone off and drank a whole bunch when I'm just trying to get prescription for something, a cold or something, you know? And so that discrimination exists not just in policing, but in all of these public institutions. But policing happens to be the most dangerous place to have that kind of discrimination. It's the most dangerous place to be giving police weapons when they may not understand the real repercussions of those weapons or the repercussions of their own internal biases, which include their biases against Indigenous people, include biases against the Black community. And that's what happened in Calgary. There was an inherent bias that Black man was uncontrollable and violent, a classic Canadian stereotype of the Black community in Canada. It's costed Canadians lives. And that's a serious issue right now today. And it's not going away because the government is not addressing it. You know, what we're seeing across the country is another example of that. No one wants to talk about the realities of white supremacy and the dangers of racism and the actual human lives it costs. It costs people's lives. And that's what happened in Calgary. And I do believe that Alert, or I think it's called Alert, but they're the independent organization that's supposed to look at conduct of police. They need to be given more tools. Organizations that hold the government accountable need to have far more tools than they have right now. They can't simply be asked to investigate these things, say the same thing they've had over and over, which was this was violent and it was likely due to racism. They've said that. We know that. We know it's a fact. They need to go to the point of making sure they're held accountable for it. You know, I don't want to see more police get a slap on the wrist, get a paid vacation, and they come back with a gun. You know, there has to be accountability. They have to face criminal charges for what that is, because that's criminal. I can't just go murder somebody and say I was acting in the best interest of the country. I was doing my job. No, like there has to be accountability. That police officer and the police, the Calgary police itself need to be held accountable. A full public inquiry needs to take place, and that officer likely should face charges in a civil court, just like anyone else who takes another life would. So
I feel like for me, the most discouraging and difficult part about these conversations, as someone who works in democracy space, as someone who spent the last 4 years trying to increase the youth voter turnout, it is so exhausting to have to ask youth to get out and vote, youth who are already engaged in a very difficult relationship and like a mistrust with the system, and youth, particularly Black youth, who don't believe that politicians can change, regardless of who's in power. We are seeing the same, for lack of a better word, shit happen time and time again. And yet here we are asking Black youth to get out and vote. And for me, it's that tension that becomes exhausting as someone doing this work as a Black woman. And I don't even know what to tell folks anymore. I don't even know, you know, what to tell Black and Indigenous youth anymore, because I do think youth need to get out and vote. But then the people in power don't do anything about issues like this.
Well, I completely agree. There's a huge disconnect between what we know is right and what has to happen and action. You know, Canada's really bad at action, but this is, I think, a point that's really important to make is Canada isn't only its politicians. There's two other really critical parts of our democracy. There's our courts in particular. The courts play a dramatic role in how our democracy functions and how we can utilize those systems. And I think that the next frontier, I guess you can call it, you know, for us young people in politics is to really look at those court systems and challenge them and say, where have you been? You know, you've declared in the Supreme Court that these are problems. You've told politicians these are problems, but you're not enforcing them. You're not giving the tools to the enforcement agencies that require them and the training to see these issues as truly ones that have to change. And that's where my problem is our systems don't talk to each other for good and bad reasons. You know, the court, the judicial system, and our executive branch and our House of Commons don't talk. We don't talk to each other. And that's a serious issue. You can convince one body, you can convince Parliament that this is a really important thing to do. But does that change how our judicial system works? And does that change how enforcement looks on the ground? Because they won't let us talk to them. You know, I can't go talk to the police directly and say, why aren't you doing your job? You know, you had time to do this and you're not doing it. But I do think that there is accountability measures built within the other orders of government, including the justice system, that need to be one of our next focuses as young people, to say we've already convinced the politicians, we've convinced the court systems, but why hasn't our judicial system truly moved in a way that can hold politicians even accountable for these things? So I think there has to be more accountability for politicians in their understanding of these issues. Like, I've heard conservatives say the exact thing I've told you, for example. They know the language. They know it. You know, they're brilliant, they're smart, they read public polling. They can read off a piece of paper and say the exact same thing, but would they do it? And what do they have in terms of their powers to make it happen? And that's a tougher question, because oftentimes partisanship stops them from ever getting to that point. But I do think we're getting closer and closer to making sure there's true accountability for police. And I think what we've seen over the last few days, for example, or weeks, I should say, in Ottawa particularly, shows us that police need to be more accountable. We need to find better ways to monitor these things, which is why I and many New Democrats right now, we're talking about a national inquiry. We want to see a national inquiry, someone held accountable as to why these issues are taking place in police, particularly within the police systems. We want to hear police officers, we want to hear police captains, we want to hear the whole chain of command describe to us exactly, and to all Canadians, how something like that was possible. How something like what happened in Calgary was even possible. Who is it that has to be charged? Who is it that has to be held accountable for that? Because right now, no one does. They die, our relatives die at a disproportionate rate, and not one person ever gets held to account. And that's why I think young people in particular do not trust these institutions. And for good reason. They're just not working for them. They're not. And so I think that there's a lot more to go, a lot more distance to be traveled before young people put the legitimacy to these institutions that they're demanding. Because I don't think we should just grant carte blanche authority and participation in these institutions that have largely failed Canadians and still do, particularly young people.
It's just an impossible, like, chicken or the egg situation with that, because is it like the government should do better, or like does it not benefit the powers that be for young people not to engage anymore, right? Like they get to keep their status quo if there are less people like Blake taking up space in Parliament, if there are less people like us talking about these things on social media. Like they get to continue their colonial trash while the rest of us are like, yeah, I mean, it off like I had a it feels like it's like almost a waiting game of like,
it is almost,
for people to retire and like to move in, get more progressives in there, but that also is not an option because people's lives are at risk right now.
Like climate change, for example, like that's a hard time limit that people are just taking all day on and thinking, like, I'm sure everyone here has watched, what's that movie called with Leonardo DiCaprio? It came out in Christmas.
Don't Look Up. Oh my
Don't
gosh,
Look Up.
Nothing has ever felt, that movie was triggering. I was like, this is life. This is actually life.
You see, I have so much criticism about that movie, but let's not get into that.
Criticism for But I do think that one thing it does teach us is that there is a kind of apathy in politics. It shows that apathy. And I think that's an important message in there about how apathy truly works. And apathy is motivated by capital, by rich people who want to see opportunity where there truly isn't any opportunity. You know, when we're measuring our planet's survival, our species survival versus how much money I made this year, totally uncomparable. But that decision is truly being made today. That's the weight that people make that decision on. And it's brutal. And I think to your point about young people, they don't want us in those spaces. They really don't. You know, for example, we tabled a bill, New Democrats, where we want to lower the age of voting to 16. There's nothing wrong with that. Most 16-year-olds I know are more engaged than the people who are above 60. They're more in tune with the country. They have a vested interest in the future. It's more their world than it is anyone else's. And that's an Indigenous teaching I learned, that our children are it's truly their world more than it is ours. And we've forgone that principle. We've forgone that as a country. And I do think that we should still push to have young people enfranchised. Young people deserve to have a vote. And if we enfranchised everyone above 16, I can guarantee you they're going to come out and they're going to vote for change, and they're going to vote out some of these people. They're going to vote out some of the people who've stopped or have gambled on their future. And I really hope that bill passes too. You can look that one up too. I don't remember the exact C number, but it's Taylor Backrat, who's retabled the Vote 16 Act.
Vote 16,
so I think Vote 16 Act, we need to get that done because we need more young people voting. But that's what they're scared of. They know that they're not going to vote for them.
I kind of love what Trish said, lower the age. Honestly, the less time you have left on this planet, the less influence you should be able to have on it. It doesn't make sense.
Trish says 65 plus shouldn't vote.
Yeah, exactly. That's the same argument. You know, I always think like if you're going to restrict people at 16, we might as well start restricting people at 65 then. It's seriously.
Literally. You know, like if you're no longer affected by the current social issues, then tap out.
Yeah.
Yeah, if that's the qualifier for enfranchisement, then that's the path we're going to go down. But I hope we don't go that route. I hope that people see enfranchisement as a good thing, that the more votes we have, the better it is for democracy, the better it is for our country. And you're going to hear these arguments. Like you can go to Taylor's Twitter when he has a little video saying, I can't wait to pass the bill, you know, Vote 16. 1,000 messages from people over 50 saying, we can't do that. They're irresponsible. They're just going to legalize all the drugs and then crime is going to go up and then the country is going to be bad and my taxes are going to be gone and my $1 million house will be taken. That's literally the extent of that discussion. And it's ridiculous. You know, there's far more to talk about. Young people have far more to gain with their inclusion.
Well, Blake, it is 6:03 and we know that you are full and busy. Well, 6:03 here with us. Maybe it's not where you are. I actually don't know where you are.
Yeah, Misquachiwa Skagan. Beaver
so it's 3:03?
It is 4:03.
Come on, DJ, do your math. Just kidding. I didn't know.
No, DJ, that was close.
That was really close. I always get messed up between Edmonton and BC. I'm sorry.
Yeah, me too. No, I did that today like 5 times. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah,
this
it means a lot.
Amazing. Please come back whenever. Just be like, hello, can I come back? And we'd be like, heck yes.
Oh, deal. Okay.
Well, so honestly.
Oh, of course. No, I want to be transparent with folks, and you know, there was no script here. For those wondering, I didn't have a script. These are just genuinely the answers to the questions, and you may disagree with them, and that's okay too. And if you do, I'm always happy to learn more. Send me an email. I'm not sure if Paige is here or somebody that could put my email in the chat for folks, but I always want to hear from folks. You can also follow me here, and we're going to keep these conversations going because the more I hear from you, and the more you hear from me, the better our democracy is going to be. And thanks to you
in the post
on OnCanada Project. Like, this is remarkable. I learned a little bit about OnCanada Project. You know, you folks are doing a huge service to people, especially young people who are facing an intimidating and exclusionary system. So you're filling a gap that's so needed. I love it.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're just trying to do our part. Everyone has a role to play.
That's right.
But,
all right, friends.
Thank you, everyone.
Page with the email, but we'll also include it in the post when we do.
Your poor inbox is about to be flooded with like every critique demand.
Yes, no. As long as it's, you know, it's Pink Shirt Day. Be kind, friends. Be kind. There's ways to have discussions where it doesn't have to come from a place of anger. Even if it does, there's ways to communicate that anger in good ways. So I'm really excited to hear from folks and speak to all you again. That's for sure.
Well, thank you, and everyone have a very nice rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, friends.